Well, hey everybody, welcome back to Spartan Theology. Got a pretty exciting show today. I'm going to be interviewing Jon DePue. We've talked a little bit through email and prior to the show, but not too much. So I'm pretty excited. Not exactly sure where this conversation go. And I have my own stream open. How lame is that? But okay, well yeah, I'll bring him in and let him introduce himself, and then we'll kind of get started from there. So here's Jon. If you could, just kind of give people a little introduction, who you are, why you're interested in the topic, just talking about Paul in general and Christianity in general. Just a little introduction to yourself, if you don't mind.
Yeah. Despite what I'm wearing, I do not play for the Chicago Cubs. I, it's opening day, so I had to be decked out in my Cubs gear. Um, yes, I'm Jon DePue. I currently work as a on the pastoral staff at a church in North Carolina, and I work primarily in kind of directing the Christian education programs at that church. I've been working in Christian ministry for about 8 years. Um, yeah, as far as the interest in Paul goes, I studied religious studies in undergrad in philosophy, and so there was a class that was offered on Paul and theology there, and I didn't really know much about Paul at the time, so I decided to take that class and became really interested in his thinking, in his letters, and then when I went to Duke after that for my MDiv, um, there were tons of classes that were on Paul that were offered there. There are a lot of really strong Paul scholars at Duke, and so I just kind of fell in love with Paul at that point, and my advisor at Duke kind of took me under his wing a bit when I expressed interest in Paul, and so I was kind of mentored by him, and still a very good friend. He officiated my wedding last year, so very close. So Paul has become a big part of my life, and more recently, an even bigger part because I've been doing a number of uh, YouTube interviews on Paul. So it's re-entering kind of for me. But yeah, I guess that would be the how I got interested. I'm currently writing a book on Paul that should be out next year, hopefully, through Cascade Books. So be on the lookout for that.
Well, yeah, we'll do. That's awesome. Okay. Yeah, and yeah, I was gonna say I can't believe when you first came in, I was gonna say something about the Cubs jersey, and then I asked something else, completely forgot. But
Yeah.
nice, yeah,
No, I figured I should explain so
yeah.
I don't
That's actually
normally
nice.
dress like this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not what you wear when you're preaching at church or
No, that's a good idea though.
yeah,
Maybe next Sunday. Yeah.
yeah. Nice. Yeah, it's nice to have some sports back, but
I know it's
yeah,
been weird, but yeah, what are you gonna
yeah.
do?
So I guess what I wanted to talk about, I know we were going to talk about kind of your perspective on Paul, which is kind of I don't know exactly how to classify. There's like but the apocalyptic perspective. But before we get like too specific on that or anything, I just kind of want to like I guess in my head, not up until recently, like obviously people have different interpretations of the New Testament scripture in general, but I didn't know about these like specific schools of thought on Paul. So if you kind of just give like an overview of kind of like how these have been kind
Yeah.
of, the new perspective, reformed,
Yeah.
just kind of overview if you don't mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there are three main kind of schools of thought in Paul in the scholarly discussion. Um, One is the apocalyptic approach to Paul, the apocalyptic reading, which is the camp that I'm situated in. Um, uh, the other is the new perspective on Paul, which is kind of a rising out of the work of E.P. Sanders. Um, he was a Duke guy, as a matter of fact. He wrote a book in 1977 called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, that kind of started to get people to question the usual reading, or you indicated it's more of a kind of reformed reading. So that's the third one is the sort of, I guess, traditional Protestant reading of Paul that's kind of dominated. And I still think it does basically dominate um, Paul's construal. even today. But Sanders came along and saw that there's something wrong with how the old perspective or the Reform perspective was depicting Jews in Judaism. So the new perspective is really kind of a response to that stuff initially, to the stuff to do with Jews and Judaism, giving a kind of more accurate account of Judaism in the second century or in the first century, and the kind of Judaism that would have been around in Paul's day. So those are kind of the three main camps. If I could kind of give scholars that are situated in those camps that people may know. So New Perspective, broadly represented by people like N.T. Wright and James Dunn, principally. And then the Old Perspective is people like Douglas Moo, Tom Schreiner, more evangelical type folks. And then the apocalyptic approach was really arising out of a scholar named J. Lewis Martin, or Lou Martin, who sadly passed away a few years ago. But he was kind of the main figure in that in the 20th and then also the 21st century. But there are historical antecedents of the apocalyptic reading that go back quite a bit further. But yeah, those are the three approaches that tend to dominate. There are kind of different variations and kind of attempts to fuse some of them together, some of the insights from those different schools. But yeah, broadly speaking, those are the three main approaches to Paul.
Awesome. Yeah. So, and it's like when you hear something like new perspective, I know that like turns people off. Like, well, obviously it's, new, but it's just like new way of looking at it, but it doesn't like just stand.
Yeah, right.
Like obviously it goes back, like you said.
Yep.
Yeah. So as far as so this is basically I learned about the new perspective first, like a little while back, and I was reading some of N.T. Wright, and I just kind of read like an introduction book. So it really like the way I saw it, it kind of all varies on how Paul understood and thought about the Judaism, like what was Judaism of the time, and how did Paul relate to that Judaism? Because the new perspective, if I'm understanding correct, it was more that like generally, and like I go to like a Reformed church, and most of my people I interact with definitely hold to like the old Reformed perspective. And it really, and I've noticed, like I think I had thought about this before, but it's right, like how Paul thought the way they understand it, or that perspective understands it, is like the law is like a burden that you can't fulfill, and that's like what everyone just falls short of that view, and that's really not the view that Jews had at the time. So when I really liked a lot of what the new perspective had to say about Judaism, I'm just not too sure about like the way they interpret some of what Paul's saying, and I don't know if that's maybe where you're at, like, or why you kind of went to this apocalyptic view, or
that it kind of is, because the approach to Paul that I learned in college was basically the new perspective. So that was sort of what I was initially trained in, and then kind of when I came to Duke, I was like, well, hang on a minute, I like the stuff they're saying about Jews and Judaism, sort of reconstructing that in a way that's more accurate and sensitive to Jews and Judaism and the history of Israel. That stuff is good, but the way that I thought they applied that to Paul's texts exegetically, especially to do with works of law or works of Torah, didn't really make sense. It seemed to clash with what was actually going on in the data that we have. And so it seemed like, okay, well, the old perspective is actually a little bit closer on the actual words that Paul is using and interpreting them closely in key passages. The new perspective is doing something that doesn't seem to really fit with what Paul is saying. And so the apocalyptic kind of reading seemed to offer both a solid account of Jews and Judaism, and it also, I think, handles the exegetical stuff better than the new perspective. So that was really quite attractive to me, and that's kind of what got me on board with the apocalyptic approach.
Yes, that's kind of what I was thinking. Right, it's like I'd read a book a while back before we even talked about Paul. I don't know if you heard of it. It's called like Bearing God's Name. The woman that wrote it, Carmen Imes. If you haven't heard about it, it's a really good book. I don't know.
Cool.
And she just the basis of the book was really interesting. She did her dissertation all on the commandment, like to bear God's name in vain, and how
Mm-hmm.
that has like nothing to do with words that come out of your mouth.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like we interpret it, and
It's
it's
not
all about
clear.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, like bearing God's name. She related it back to like the Levite priests with the name of
Mm-hmm.
Yahweh on their forehead. So it was
Mm-hmm.
really cool. But the way
Yeah.
she talked about the law was just like how it was almost like a freedom. Like
Yeah.
she related it back to like have my dog here. It just reminds me. But like when you bring a dog to like a dog park, they have more freedom than if you just like let them in the middle of a
That's right.
crowded highway. You know what I
That's
mean?
right.
Like
Yeah.
even though there's a fence, like the law acts like a fence.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like a guide. I don't know if we and me.
Yeah.
Yeah, I might have. I
Lagging
think
a
we're back
bit.
though. Can you hear
Yeah, I
me?
think. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I can. Cool. Yeah, I'm not in the greatest internet, so but yeah, it's just
Cool.
kind of how she viewed the law and how Jews would have viewed the law as like it's not some burden necessarily. Like, and then when I was reading about the new perspective, talking about how like the sacrifices are built into the law. No, even from the beginning, it wasn't. You
Yeah.
weren't meant to
Yeah.
uphold every rule forever. So interpreting Paul as thinking of the law as his burden seemed once they brought it
Yeah.
up
It
like
doesn't make sense.
it just
Yeah.
didn't make sense. But you're right.
And
As far as the
yeah.
exegesis, go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. He himself talks about uh his doing the law. He basically thought he was really really good at it. There was no burden there for him when he
Hmm.
was in that specific sect of Judaism prior to his calling as an apostle. He thought he was awesome at it. There was no no indication that he was plagued by some pressure coming from the law that made him feel guilty, right, about his sin or
Hmm.
anything like that. It's not there. And I think you're exactly right about the how most Jews tended to view the law, which is it's not this sort of imposition of, and that's why law isn't necessarily a helpful translation. I think we should be thinking about Torah, right? So it's an instruction. It's instructions that you get from God. Most Jews probably thought about the Torah like we think about the Bible. It's a presentation of sacred texts, right? That God has
Hmm.
given to us and that we're enjoined to learn from and to teach one another ethically in the light of, right? Um, it's instruction. Yeah. It's not this harsh thing that sets up a conditional or contractual relationship or anything like that. But yeah, and that's one of the key insights from the new perspective um, that they see in Judaism and try to bring into Paul's text. I just don't think they do it very well. I
Yeah,
think way
yeah,
better.
and I think that's yeah. So we can kind of get into like the actual apocalyptic perspective. So, like when I first heard this, I don't know. It's like it just seems like a strange name. Like, is it just like I don't know. So, like maybe kind of just an overview of like what sets it apart from the new
Sure.
perspective, like makes specific,
Yeah.
and like why necessarily apocalyptic. Is it what
Yeah.
exactly is that referring to? So.
Sure. So this kind of goes back to the guy that I mentioned, J. Lee Martin. Um, he wrote an essay, I think in '67. It's one of his earliest essays called Epistemology at the Turn of the Ages. It's in this little book called Theological Issues in the Letters of Paul. In that essay and his Galatians commentary, which is famous and it's really a magisterial work on Galatians that you should all buy if you can. It's very helpful to kind of it opens up Galatians in a really really great way. But anyway, in his work, he sees Paul's gospel declaration as resting on a revelation from God centered on Jesus, right? Um, so the resulting reading of Paul from that is, I think, usefully known as apocalyptic. People kind of get upset about that because there's a group of people, some of them coming from the new perspective, who really just want to keep apocalyptic for apocalyptic literature. They don't like it being the word being used for something else. And so there can be some sort of misunderstanding there. But I think it's a good word to use because it's coming from the Greek word that Paul uses for revelation in Galatians 1:12, which is apocalypsis. Um, so it's an apocalypse, right? So that's where the word is coming from. It's coming straight from Paul. It's a lexicographical kind of move. Um, so strictly speaking, the starting point for apocalyptic readings is really about epistemology. It's about how we know God, how we know what we know about God. It's about truth criteria. Um, so it's basically saying that Jesus reveals the truth about God, and this truth is a disclosure of what God is really like to us. And Paul says the same thing, right? He learned what God was really like because God revealed his son to him, right? So his understanding of who God is very much centered on Christ, but it's also mediated to him in the power of the Holy Spirit. So there's a sort of Trinitarian dimension of this apocalyptic reading, where Paul is kind of enfolded into a divine communion in that revelation. And he likes to talk about that in terms of being in Christ. So in Christ language is super important for the apocalyptic reading. Paul uses that language over 60 times in his letters. And it does a lot of heavy lifting for him in his argumentation. So that's kind of the starting point for apocalyptic. It's a revelation of God in Jesus Christ, mediated by the power of the Spirit. And in that revelation, we're enfolded into a divine reality. Yeah, so that's the starting point. I can say more about kind of where it goes after that, but that's kind of the initial thing. That's the initial place that apocalyptic readers are kind of coming from.
Yeah, it seems a lot like apocalyptic reading really tries to focus on Christ as the center,
Yeah, it's all
and
about
not so
Jesus.
much like, yeah, the reform perspective more focusing from that other video. I don't know if this is, but the reform perspective more focusing on like justification and the
Yeah,
law and stuff like
yeah.
that, and apocalyptic perspective is more on Christ. And apparently, your wife is asking if you want something from Jimmy John's in the chat.
tell her, tell her that I'm good,
Yeah,
but I appreciate it.
yeah, I just
Is
saw
he
that pop
texting you?
up.
He was texting me.
I don't know. I saw it pop up in the chat, but that was funny.
Thanks, sweetie.
But yeah. So I don't know. I have a few questions. I don't know exactly like where we want to go. Best way to kind
Oh
of
yeah.
explain this.
Can I say something real quick before
Yeah.
we move on? Just kind of set out the distinctives of the approaches. You
Hmm.
mentioned that the old perspective or the reformed perspective, or however you want to talk about it, is kind of it's centered on things like justification and the law and that kind of those sorts of terms. I think also it's really a human centered journey. It's you being confronted with the law, not being able to do it, you're guilty. That sort of pushes you toward an easier situation, which is faith in Christ, and then you kind of jump on over into the Christian reality, right? So it's centered on you and what you do. And then the new perspective is really concerned with giving an accurate account of Jews and Judaism and how that allows you to read Paul differently. And it tends to emphasize the sort of corporate dimension of Paul's thinking instead of this individual journey. Um, and then the apocalyptic kind of approach is the starting point, and it centers Jesus himself in his death and resurrection, um, and how we participate in that, how we become a part of that. So, yeah. So I think that's how I would distinguish them.
Yeah, yeah, I did. Yeah, I forgot. I was planning on bringing that up, but yeah, it's a lot more about like I'm in the video I'd watched on Trinity Radio. If anybody, Nick Quint did a video
Yeah.
talking about this. This gave me like a little bit of insight, but a lot of what it seems like is like the reform perspective is like all about individuals,
Yeah.
justification,
That's right.
and but when you look back to first century Judaism, it doesn't seem like that's really what they were concerned about. It wasn't about you as a individual. It was about what God's going to
Right.
do, like to bring to His people together, or like the whole
Yeah.
world in general. You know, how to new creation and stuff like that, and less
Yeah.
about just the guilt of one person.
Yep.
And I think
Yep.
it has a lot to. And I guess the way they understand like Paul's idea of sin is very different in the
Mm-hmm,
different perspectives.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
No, yeah. So I don't know. Maybe kind of talk about like the way Paul understood sin, and I think that gives a good picture of like what sets this perspective apart a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So now
If
that,
that makes sense.
yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
unless there's something else that can like kind of bridge the gap a little better. I'm like I've been thinking about this for a
Yeah.
little while, so my
That
mind's all
the
over the
sin
place.
stuff, the sin stuff is definitely a distinctive kind of feature of the apocalyptic reading. But it's also because I think I said this in the video I did with Hayden. up front is I don't like talking about the sin stuff too much too up front in terms of the description of the gospel, because I don't think Paul does. I think for him, because he's an apocalyptic thinker, he's thinking about sin in the light of Jesus, kind of looking back. So it's not something, sin isn't something you discover for yourself. It's something that Jesus reveals as you're being delivered and saved and released from the problem that's confronting you, the sin stuff, the flesh, all of that. So now that we're located in Christ, we can look back and see that there is a really horrible plight that we're involved with that has to do with sin and death and the flesh and evil and the powers and all of that sort of stuff. And the way that Paul likes to talk about those things is in terms of kind of an incarcerating or an enslaving force. He talks about the flesh like that. He dramatizes sin in similar terms. The sort of cosmic powers are also kind of waging war on you and harming you and damaging you. So sin is not so much kind of individual missteps or mistakes that you make, getting parking tickets or something like that. It's really something much more awful. It's something that damages you and damages your freedom. You're not free to will yourself out of that. So it's a power. Okay, and then you get to the reformed kind of reading, and sin is a misstep. It is an individual transgression that you make when you fail to obey God, right? So it's something you do. It's not principally something that holds you captive and damages your will. You willingly choose to do bad things, and that's sin. Okay, so that's the distinctive kind of sin that apocalyptic approaches kind of give, as against the old reading. So.
Okay. Yeah. So, and I guess that trying to think like where to go next, because I know that. Would you say the apocalyptic perspective kind of? I mean, I'm sure, like obviously, the way you interpret scripture, like it's one big story. So, does apocalyptic have a certain perspective, like on the atonement or something? Like, is there kind of like, are they less penal substitution and more a different view of the atonement, or is that kind of something a little separated and like
Yeah,
that?
yeah.
I don't know. Is that what? Do
It's a
you,
good
yeah.
question. It's a good question. Yeah, it's definitely very different than the sort of punitive or penal approach to the atonement, um, which is really just centered on the cross. It's a punishment that Jesus endures on the cross, and then you get kind of the benefits of that if you believe in Jesus, right? Um, the kind of the atonement that the apocalyptic approach gives includes both the death and resurrection of Jesus as the atoning and saving thing. It's not just the death. So Christ becomes like us so that we might become like Christ. Christ enters into our situation, our enslaved situation that I was just talking about, shoulders that, bears it, lowers it, gets executed, and then all of that stuff that's been harming us and taking up residence in our condition gets terminated and it's done away with. It's it's dead and it's buried, right? But that doesn't do you much good if you're just dead and buried. You need something else. So Jesus is resurrected, and we participate in that through the Spirit. We're resurrected and reconstituted and remade in the way that we've always been meant to exist, which is in communion with God forever, in perfection and fellowship. So the atonement really includes both the death and the resurrection very centrally. You can't kind of separate those two or emphasize one at the expense of the other. Okay, does that make sense?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely does. Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, like I said, I'm all over the place. So
No, you're fine.
does this?
Take this
Yeah,
wherever you will. Yeah.
yeah. So I'm kind of thinking, like, does this? Is it something? What kind of brought about these different perspectives, and like, is it just kind of like how one view just kind of takes hold of scholarship and like the church, and just kind of people don't question it too much? Is it something like in? I don't know. Is there something we learned about first century Judaism or something that kind of brought this change about? I don't.
Yep.
I
Yeah.
was kind of curious about that. Yeah.
Good question. Yeah. So the dominant reading prior to the rise of the New Perspective post Sanders. Um, yeah, it really kind of was the main approach in both the scholarly world and also in the church. And the New Perspective comes as a reaction to the Old Perspective. So the Old Perspective was just sort of the way people did things for a long, long time in scholarship. And then the New Perspective comes along and says, whoa, your description of Jews and Judaism really isn't fair. What we're discovering about first century Judaism is not that they were a bunch of legalists running around trying to get saved by works, right? Which is what the Old Perspective basically says. What we learned was that Judaism was what Sanders called, they were referred to as covenantal nomism. Covenantal nomism. So that's a key word. And what that's really indicating is that Jews are in a covenant with God. They're in this irrevocable relationship with God. That they don't have to work their way toward to stay inside of that relationship. They don't have to do stuff to kind of to maintain their position in the covenant with God. What the Torah does is it's their response to this loving covenantal relationship. Again, it's like the Bible for us. We're in a covenant with God. God gives us the instructions about what it means to live good lives, and then we do that. Not because we're trying to earn God's love or something like that. We're trying to work our way to heaven, but because we love God and God loves us. It's a response. It's not a condition or anything like that. So the New Perspective was really kind of responding to the Old Perspective's inaccurate account of Judaism, and so that's kind of how that happened historically. And then the apocalyptic approach is quite recent in terms of getting to talk about it as a distinct group. It has those historical antecedents that have been running back to certain key German scholars in the dawn of the 20th century. People like Ernst Käsemann. Who else would be in there? Käsemann. And then sort of later on, J.C. Becker. People like that. Albert Schweitzer is a really important figure. William Vrede is very important. So they're all kind of doing kind of apocalypse stuff back in the 20th century. But it wasn't until Martin's work that he really kind of gave an anchor for a particular approach, which happened essentially around the same time as the New Perspective, maybe a little bit after, but yeah. So in terms of like why one becomes dominant over the other, I don't know.
Yeah.
I think part of it is to do with just the what we inherit as Protestants and the theology that we sort of were given, and because most biblical scholars working in Paul were Protestants, they're given this kind of theology from their tradition, and so that's how their reading of Paul is going to look too. It's going to cohere with that. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of.
It just seems like, I mean, some things just don't get questioned, and then they just, yeah. But I don't know. As you were talking, like you say, it has like historical. Is there like a particular church father that you kind of point to that maybe had a different view on Paul? I don't know too much about church fathers, so maybe this is like an irrelevant question or something. But I don't know, just if there's anybody that was had a different reading that kind of got pushed out, maybe, or just not as popular, or something like this that you can kind of trace back to, or maybe like I said.
I would say something. One interesting approach from a church father should be Gregory of Nyssa. He wrote a book on the soul and the resurrection, and it's really about 1 Corinthians 15. And he sees that text as where Paul's talking about the resurrection as really the center of Paul's theology. And I basically agree with him. And I think he's doing that. He did that very early on too. He saw that Paul is giving a gospel that's about life and new life. So he was already really onto this sort of apocalyptic stuff way back when. That's really the heart of Paul. Yeah. And then Augustine shows up and does some slightly weird stuff with Paul. Yeah,
Yeah.
but he kind of gets blamed for the old perspective in some ways. Christopher Stendhal wrote a very famous piece called "Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West," which is really an important essay for the new perspective and also for apocalyptic readers too. But he kind of traces some of this stuff back to Augustine, and
Okay.
through Luther as well, we get this kind of ugly account of the gospel. But I don't know if it's quite accurate. But yeah, I think
Yeah.
Nissa was onto this stuff early on. Yeah,
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's really in that too, like when it's really about like you could when you understand Paul in this way, it really changes like your whole view of the gospel, and like you said, this ugly view as opposed like so really. And I mean, I don't want to like put down because I don't even necessarily know what I hold to too much
sure.
apart, but like when you hear the reform perspective, like they put it in that video, I remember, it was just like the gospel is more about repent and be forgiven and you're justified and
Yeah,
you don't even hear the word Christ. And when you
yeah,
like
right.
this perspective, it's like
Yes,
Jesus Christ, this is where it starts. Now
yeah.
let's figure out what happened as a
Hmm.
result of Christ's resurrection.
Yeah, that's
Eh,
really well put.
Okay. Nice.
Yeah, I the reason why I'm only half joking when I say it's an ugly reading, the old reading, is because it really does depict God in this sort of harsh, conditional, contractual way, right? Where you're given these expectations through the law or through the law that's written on your heart, right? For pagans. Um, and if you don't do them, then God's really, really angry with you and is going to execute you unless you have faith in Jesus, right? So it sets up God and the God and human relationship in this really antagonistic way and depicts God as a God of retributive justice, right? He's kind of like I don't know what would be a good word. He's like a judge of some kind, but a really negative one. God is a
Hmm.
judge, but he's not that sort of judge. Um, but it depicts God in this sort of like law and order kind of model, and depicts the universe in this kind of law and order way. So that's why I think it's ugly. It's because it's doing that sort of stuff instead of the God of merciful love and compassion, who extends mercy to God's people even when they turn away from Him. Right? Christ died for us while we were still sinful. That tells you something, right?
Yes, definitely does. My dog's over here barking at birds at the window.
Oh,
Yeah. But yeah, so and I had something I was gonna say. So I guess does I don't know, there's one place I want to go. So do apocalyptic readers is there like that kind of view their eschatology too, or like most of them hold like a
yeah,
particular view on eschatology,
yeah.
or yeah, I'm sure
Good.
say
That's a
something
great
about
question. Yeah. So there is a really important place for eschatology in the apocalyptic reading. It's essentially it's a kind of realized eschatology that's going on, right? Because you're really participating in Jesus's death and resurrection right now in a very real sense, and you know this because you have the mind of Christ. You can see that you're a part of this new reality. But there's also a sense in which it's not fully there. We're not fully raised. We're not fully within God's glory, right? And living with Him in perfection and fellowship. Um,
yeah. I listen to a lot of not just that, I listen to a lot of Michael Heiser, and he puts it like
yeah,
already but not yet. He says that a lot.
that's another good way of putting it. I think as long as we're not thinking about it in sort of mutually exclusive terms, those two realities, the present one and the future one, because there is a kind of overlapping sense for Paul where we still really are kind of in the old reality that's kind of ruled by Satan, and uh, we're in Adam still in a certain way, but we're also in Christ, right? And which one is superior? Obviously, Jesus is. So we're kind of situated in both. But Paul really wants to say, and this is why it really is a realized eschatology. Paul really thinks that we're resurrected. and that he's been raised in a certain way as well. So that's kind of the eschatological dimension of it. It's realized, and also kind of looking forward to a future where everything is perfected. So
Okay, nice. Yeah, exactly. We actually got a question here in the chat. What is
great.
your interpretation of Matthew 5:20? I could pull that up.
You're fine.
She's just like, won't stop barking.
Really interested in those birds.
Yeah, I don't know. It's this new house. She's all like on alert. She's a Jack Russell, so she's like one of the most
Oh,
ridiculous dogs. Yeah. So Matthew 5:20, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes or Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Okay, yeah. Let's see how this definitely plays in. So I don't know. What's your thoughts on like? Well, I mean, this is a gospel, so it's obviously not Paul, but
yeah. Matthew's running with a very different soteriology, I think, than Paul. Um, I got a question on Hayden's channel about if I think there are different approaches to the gospel and to salvation in the different books that we have, and I think there are. I think this is a good indication of that. Matthew expects that people who follow, this is really important, people who follow this new kind of Christ-shaped Torah or law, people who follow that are saved. They're the sheep. They make it through into the kingdom. People who don't do that are in trouble. However, we want to talk about the whatever bad or negative state is Matthew's working with. It's kind of up for debate. But he certainly thinks that we do stuff to get saved, right? Did you, uh, uh, are you somebody who is visiting the prisoner? Are you someone who's clothing the naked? XYZ, right? So it's dependent on stuff you do. I don't like that very much. I'm perfectly happy with saying that I think Paul's doing something very different. And I'm not an inerrantist, so I'm not committed to harmonizing those two approaches. Whereas, so Paul's approach is that it's an unconditional saving activity in Christ that saves you, and you respond to it in faith. But yeah, Matthew's doing something very different, and it seems kind of harsh. I'll definitely say that, but it's based on things you do. That's what people forget. People read in that you're getting saved and become a part of the kingdom because you believe in Jesus, and Matthew never says that.
yeah, that's something like even studying the Bible. It took even a while to realize that like you just assume like oh it's in there somewhere,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
mean it's really not, and we assume a lot for sure, and like just view scripture with these lenses on, and when you take them off, it's pretty wild.
yeah.
What?
It can be jarring too once you realize,
Hmm.
oh no, like this stuff that I thought was always there really isn't. It's pretty humbling. Yeah,
Yeah, and it's like interesting to hear someone say too that like you think Matthew has a different
yeah,
view
yeah.
than Paul. Obviously, a lot of people are not comfortable saying something like that.
No,
So
no. So FC Bauer has some great work on sort of the development of Christian communities and how different Christian groups were kind of at odds with each other a lot and clashing and kind of fighting over stuff throughout the history of the early church. And we see this in Paul too, right? He has opponents all over the place that he's really upset with, that he think are enemies of the cross, right? Who are preaching a very different sort of gospel than he is. And we see that in our New Testament documents too. Matthew's saying something very different. I think Matthew would be upset with Paul. I think Paul would be upset with what Matthew's doing. Yeah.
yeah, actually, like Laura, your wife, was the first person I had heard that like said it like that. Like Matthew and Mark, I think like probably didn't get along.
Yeah.
In my head, it was always like, oh no, these guys are all buddies, or whatever. They just wrote four different
Right. Yeah.
accounts of this same thing.
Right. I mean, even think about Paul and Cephas, or Peter.
Hmm.
Paul claims at one point that he saw that what Peter was doing was not walking straight with the truth of the gospel. He thought what Peter was doing was very wrong when he refused table fellowship. Yeah. So
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely, yeah. So I guess we touched on eschatology a little bit, and then I
Yeah.
guess we could kind of touch on like so. Do most what about like their view of hell related to the apocalyptic? Is it like
Mhm.
I know just kind of you can get into your view? Is it kind of like a overall consensus in the apocalyptic a little bit, lean annihilationism or something like that more, or kind of I don't know. Talk a
Good
little bit
question.
about
Yeah.
yeah.
Also, just to be clear, your questions aren't all over the place. You this is, I think you're asking very clear and good questions. So
Okay,
you don't need
nice,
to
thank you.
qualify it anymore.
Yeah, yeah. I'm just like thinking in my head. So yeah, yeah.
You're
Thank you.
totally fine, man. Yeah, you do. Yeah,
Yeah,
this is great. So yeah, another way to put
you're
this
breaking up a
is,
little bit, so you're probably gonna have to restart.
oh,
Yeah, I'm losing you.
can you hear me
You
now?
should come back. But, yeah,
Can you hear me now?
I can
Good.
now. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yes.
Another way to ask this would be, does what's Paul's account of judgment and sort of final destinations of people, right? Um, I'm a universalist. I'm just going to come out and say that up front. I believe that all people will be saved and God will be all in all, and that all of creation will be restored back to its original intent. Do I think Paul thinks that? Most of the time he does. Most of the time he's working with this account of salvation as being all encompassing. Everybody will be reconciled back to God. Um, every knee will bow and every tongue can gladly confess that Jesus is Lord. Right? All Israel will be saved. Right? Romans 5:12-21. There's a magnificent account of Adam and Christ, where Christ is so superior to Adam that all people, all will be delivered. That's what he says. So most of the time he's doing that. Now the question is, what do you do with texts that seem to depict some kind of judgment? And a lot of times they're depicting it in terms of destruction. In the Thessalonian correspondence and Philippians, you get some clear examples of a destructive account of judgment. What tends to happen is that those destruction texts get read as the final eschatological horizon of all horizons beyond all ages, where God is judging people. This is, again, something that I learned from Gregory of Nyssa. What happens if we think about those harsh judgment texts that have to do with destruction as being in sequence prior to all of the universalist stuff that Paul talks about most of the time? What happens if you place judgment kind of prior to that? It looks an awful lot like, I'm going to pull up a text. 1 second.
Yeah. So it's more about like not a retributive justice, but rehabilitation or whatever. I guess.
Yeah. And this is where this text is actually going to come in to play, and it's very important. Sorry for the dead air.
No, yeah, yeah. I'm like trying to look back at my questions too. So, yeah, everybody, don't turn away. I don't know. My one viewer right
Don't
now. There's actually
don't
like a yeah. There's actually
don't turn away from God's judgment.
there you go. Yeah, there's actually like a inspiring philosophy debate going on right now too. I think. So.
That's where probably everyone is.
Yeah, exactly.
To the one viewer.
Yeah.
So this is coming out of 1 Corinthians 3. This is 13 and following. Each one's works will become manifest, for the day will declare it, because it is revealed by fire. And the fire will prove what kind of work each person's is. If the work that someone has built endures, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work should be burned away, he will suffer loss, yet he shall be saved, as through fire. So it seems like a text like that has both eschatological horizons in view. You have the first one, which is you get your works and all of the negative stuff that you've done burned away and purified through fire. That's the judgment. But you're saved as through fire. You end up getting um, into that last eschatological horizon where God is all in all, and you're included in God's loving communion. So judgment is really important, right? Um, we do a lot of bad things a lot of the time that probably make God very, very irritated. Some of us more than others. So you can give sort of dramatic or grand examples of people who do horrible things, like Hitler or Stalin, something like that. You need something to keep them accountable. So there's an accountability there in that judgment. You're confronted with the things that you've done that have caused harm to other people, yourself, and God. But then it's burned away. It's done away with. That's the judgment. Okay, and then once you're cleansed of that and purified, you can be in the presence of God forever, right? But you need that purification because you can't be with God unless that occurs. You can't be with God unless you're in that kind of perfected state. So that's how I would handle kind of the judgment and hell stuff in Paul, is that there is a judgment. It's very real. It's very important for Paul. It's just not the final word for anybody.
Sounds kind of like purgatory or something, but I guess purgatory is a little different. But that's just like
there is
I don't.
there is a sense in which it's a purgation of some kind, but it's not like a space where you're at. That's kind of
Okay, yeah, I guess that's what sets purgatory apart. Yeah, I don't. I'm not super familiar exactly with the view, but
yeah. But yeah, that's how I would handle it. And I think it makes sense of the data that we have in Paul and really lets us hear those universalist texts for what they are and how expansive and merciful Paul thinks God is. So
yeah, and it's like when you bring up universalism, like it blows my mind that for some reason, like it makes people mad or something. I don't know, like whether or not you hold to it, I don't like. It's one thing, but it seems like the strangest thing that people get upset about. I don't know. Like I know Randall Rouser, who is an annihilationist, but he said something like every Christian should be a hopeful universalist at least. And like, it seems weird that you wouldn't want everyone to make it to heaven. I don't know.
You would think that, but some people are very, very committed and kind of joyfully committed to seeing people separated from God and eternally tormented, right? And I don't know where that comes from either. I don't know where that comes from either. I really don't.
I agree.
It baffles me. It really does.
Yeah, Hayden is in the chat too. He said some people are hopeful, eternal conscious tormentists.
Nice.
But yeah, nice to see some people popped in.
He made that joke to me the other day, which was amazing.
Nice.
People hope that God will end up being worse than most people that exist are.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, if that's like the case, where like the way I understand hell, like I haven't done a full research or to really like say I hold this view, but whatever it is, it's not going to be like the way we understand. It's not going to seem like this evil thing for sure. And I mean, eternal conscious torment, the way it's described, clearly sounds evil. So even if that is the case, like we're misunderstanding it somewhere. That's the way I view it. Because
that's a good, that makes sense. Yeah.
Like I just know in the end, God will make all things right, and it will be good. Well, how that actually works out, like I said, I'm not.
Sure. So yeah, you sound like a hopeful.
That's kind of the way I describe myself, like a hopeful. I mean, I hope for sure, and I'm just not. I don't think the way I view. I just don't think like definitely not a person that thinks you should use hell in your evangelism or anything like that. I think that's ridiculous. I mean, there's no way someone just is like made a mistake and didn't listen to the street preacher and then they end up in hell. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah, I agree. If you're looking for stuff to read on universalism, David Bentley Hart has a great book called That All Shall Be Saved.
I started listening to him a little bit, and he just has this like, I really like Michael Heiser and his I listen to his podcast a lot, and I just listened to a podcast with Michael Heiser where he went over how there's like how people say there's no talk of like afterlife or resurrection or stuff in the Old
Yeah.
Testament.
Right.
And he showed like in all these Psalms and stuff how there is all this information. And then like within the first 15 minutes of the David Bentley Hart interview, he was like, "Oh, there's no talk of afterlife in the Old Testament, so we can only figure it out in the New." And I was just like, "Oh." I mean, I don't even know. It just like turned me off. I'm like, I like Michael Heiser. I just listened to the opposite thing. But I do want to listen to David Bentley Hart more. He seems super interesting.
His book's really, really good. It's short and really kind of concise. The other one is it's a 2-part book called A Larger Hope. Written by
book recommendations are awesome, so I appreciate any of those.
It's written by Ramelli, and I don't know if you know who Robin Perry is. He's a good evangelical, and they tackled the sort of history of universalism from sort of Christian beginnings to, I think the last figure is Julian of Norwich, and then the second volume is sort of on basically everything after that up until now. So
have you been is your like view on universalism pretty recent? Have you been looking into this for a while? I don't know. Yeah, just kind of like your particular, like when did you kind of probably change your mind? I'm assuming you weren't a universalist the whole time you were a Christian. So
no, yeah, I would say I started off as kind of a hopeful universalist because I wanted to kind of respect God's freedom in salvation and also human freedom of response. And so Karl Barth, 20th century Swiss theologian, kind of gets read that way, and I was into Barth and still am into Barth. He gets read as kind of a hopeful universalist, even though I don't think that's quite right. So I was kind of trained to think in that way, and then I think it was really reading Paul a bit more carefully and getting involved in sort of Pauline scholarship at Duke, where I was like, yeah, I think this stuff's true. I'm kind of moving past the hopefulness of it, and I think it's actually a reality that's revealed in Jesus and who he is. So
nice. Yeah, I think it was like Douglas Campbell. Is he another apocalyptic guy? I was trying to when I was listening to some stuff, I just had that written down. I don't know if he's someone you agree with, or maybe I misheard or something. I might not even be the guy's name.
He was the guy I was talking about at the beginning.
Okay.
My mentor and teacher at Duke.
Oh, okay. My bad. I'm terrible at remembering names.
Totally so I'm on board with his project, with his approach. I've learned a ton from him and took way too many classes with him at Duke. So yeah, I'm definitely on board with his project. He's doing something very different though than some of the apocalyptic folks in terms of his reading of Romans, especially Romans 1-3. He's approaching that differently, and giving it an alternative kind of reading of it, because that's the stretch of text where most of the foundational stuff for the old reading or the usual reading or whatever you want to call it, most of it's coming out of Romans 1-3 in the text, right? So we got to do something with it. If we think Paul is speaking to us clearly and consistently with this apocalyptic gospel, and we have this text that's doing something opposite of that, how do we handle that? And so he's giving a different kind of reading of Romans 1-3.
Okay, yeah.
And I'm happy to get into that too.
Okay, yeah. I guess we can go there now. Yeah, that's what I was about to say. I don't know if we want to go into that or if we don't, but yeah, if you want to talk a little bit about the way you understand Romans 1-3, that would definitely be awesome, because I'm sure I told a lot of people I go to church with about this interview and whatnot. I'm sure like I said, I go to a Reformed church, so Romans is our bread and butter or whatever.
Yeah, very Roman centric.
Yeah,
very Roman centric people reading Romans in a particular way, right? And a lot of sort of traditional Reformed kind of theology comes out of Romans 1-3. It's coming out of that stretch of text.
I think your wife is commenting in the chat now about being locked out of the house. So I don't know if this is true thing. If your phone is just not working, I'm not. Yeah, she's I'm watching this on my phone on the front stoop. So if you want to go unlock your door. You're definitely more than welcome. Yeah.
Let me
Yeah, but I do appreciate you not like texting and stuff during the interview. But yeah, that's funny. Oh yeah, so yeah, I don't know how to. My dog even went outside, so normally I would just bring her up in the meantime. But yeah, I don't know. We don't really have too many questions. I appreciate Hayden and Invoking Theism came by, the Fifth Trumpet, True Counterphobia. Yeah, we had a few people. Like I said, there's obviously I think it's like Inspiring Philosophy and Jim Davis debate. So yeah, I don't know how that's going, but that seemed pretty interesting. So, but yeah, cool.
I don't know how that happened, but
Yeah.
okay. So I'm not going to be able to give a full account of this because I would have to walk you through every text in Romans 1 to 3. So this is kind of in a nutshell. So if you want to read more about this, you can feel like reading a 900-page book. You can you can read Douglas Campbell's The Deliverance of God, where he gives the full account of this, or you can wait for the book that we're writing, where you're going to get a kind of accessible version of it for lay people. So the book is directed toward lay people.
Okay. Well, I have
So
patience,
that will
so
be
that
helpful.
sounds good to me.
Unless we have some brave souls who want to do that. So
Yeah.
okay. What I'll say first is that if we expect Paul to be laying out his theology in terms of the usual reading in Romans 1 to 3, then we're gonna see that there. if we're looking for it, you're gonna find it there. But Paul never tells us that that's what he's doing. That he's laying out his theology in this stretch of text, right? There's no explicit warrant from the scriptures for reading the passage in that way that we usually do. So we need to see if the Bible's telling us something a little bit different, and I think it is. I think there's a perfectly good way to read this stretch of text that avoids sort of committing Paul to the nasty theological issues that come up in Romans 1 to 3. And that reading is what Douglas Campbell calls it's a Socratic reading. And Socratic arguments, which were really a staple in the ancient world, don't begin with their own position. They begin with an opponent's position and then go on to expose problems and contradictions in their opponent's position, ultimately ending up sort of silencing them and even maybe embarrassing them a little bit. So I'd suggest that Romans 1 to 3, you have Paul reducing another soteriological position that has to do with works of law, quote unquote works of law. And I think it's a Jewish Christian gospel involving Torah observance. So he's kind of targeting that, setting it up, and then reducing it to absurdity by the end of sort of the middle of chapter 3. Okay, so if that's clear, the opening of the opponent's position appears in Romans 1:18 to 32, that chunk of text. So that's kind of the opponent's. I'm going to call the opponent a teacher from now on, just so it's a bit easier. So this teacher gives this position. It's kind of like a little sermon, a little fire and brimstone sermon up front. And this teacher is definitely Jewish. You have resonances of the wisdom of Solomon in Romans 1:18 to 32. So this other person is drawing from the scriptures to make his argument. And so what Paul is doing is he's taking the key premise of that opening by the teacher, he's isolating it, and then he universalizes it into 1 to 6. So he applies what the teacher just said in the teacher's opening, and applies that system to everybody. It's not just so in 2:1 you have therefore I'm gonna botch this if I don't read it. basically saying that you just said all of this stuff. Don't you do the very same thing that you just said, right? So he's turning what the teacher just said back onto him and then universalizing what the teacher has just presented. Okay? And then chapter 2, from that point, we get a series of really embarrassing reductions of the teacher's position.
Just a little bit, but probably be back.
We good?
I think, yeah, you're good now. Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah, what I was saying was for the remainder of chapter 2, Paul is sort of giving a series of reductions that run through. And there are, I think, 3 of them to make this very simple. The first reduction that he says is, according to what the teacher just said in Romans 1:18-32, pagans don't actually need to embrace any gospel involving Jewish practices or Torah observance in order to be saved. So that's coming out of 2:12-16 and 26. In terms of the teacher's opening argument, they really only need to act in accordance with a sort of moral revelation in nature, right? What is revealed about God is plain to them, right? That's what it says early on. Plain from the cosmos, so they're without excuse, right? So they don't really need to adopt Jewish practices in order to be saved, even though the teacher wants them to. Paul's saying they don't even have to do that. That's pretty embarrassing. And what ends up happening is that now there can be righteous pagans or righteous Gentiles running around getting saved without taking on board the works of Torah, right? So there's this always been this mysterious, these mysterious figures in Romans 2 that people don't really know what to do with, which are righteous pagans. It works beautifully as an example of where the teacher's position goes, where the teacher's opening position goes. It works beautifully as an embarrassment of that position. So if you want to convert pagans, which is what the teacher is trying to do, to a kind of Jewish Christianity, you probably shouldn't do it that way. And Paul is really happy to kind of point that out. It's really self-defeating, ultimately. So according to the logic of the opponent's account in Romans 1:18-32, pagans can be saved by observing the dictates that they see revealed to them in nature or on their hearts, right? So they don't need the Jewish Torah. And so even though the teacher wants them to adopt it, they don't really need it. That's reduction 1. Reduction 2 is that nothing in this gospel obviously saves Jews either. So we have another problem. Paul continues in the second reduction in 2:17-24, where he's telling what's behind this is a story from around 19 AD, which any Jew of the time would remember, that the Emperor Tiberius expelled Jewish communities from Rome because of basically a scam that was perpetrated on a Roman noblewoman. And so ostensibly sort of religious figures had apparently absconded with a large offering of silver intended for the Jerusalem temple. So that's where you get the temple robbing point by Paul. So he's giving this big kind of dramatic example of theft and sacrilege, hypocrisy, immorality, all of that sort of stuff. So what Paul's saying is that he's not attacking Jews in general, which tends to be how this gets read. He's not talking about Jews, all Jews everywhere, in space and time. He's demonstrating that that not even circumcision or Torah observance guarantees that you're going to live a good and virtuous life and hence be saved. So he's appealing to that story to say, hang on a minute, there's no guarantee that even if you do observe Torah that you're going to be saved. Because look at these Jews from the past who had the Torah and did all these horrible things, right? So conversion to Jewish customs is basically doubly useless for guaranteeing salvation. And Jews themselves might actually find themselves, according to the teacher's gospel, in trouble on the day of judgment if they fail to obey the law, right? So there's no guarantee that the law is going to do this for Jews either. So that's reduction 2. And so these 2 reductions have, they sort of generate another possibility that's rather painful for the teacher's gospel. And that is that uncircumcised and righteous pagans, so the pagans who do the stuff that's revealed on their heart or in nature and do it well, may end up mocking circumcised but sinful Jews on the day of judgment. Right? Which is exactly what the teacher doesn't want to happen, but according to his own position, this is where it can go. You can get righteous pagans and unrighteous Jews, and the pagans will sort of be laughing at the Jews who get punished, right? Because they've figured it out how to do the law, how to obey God by looking at nature. So the principle of desert, so the principle of sort of works-based stuff, which is self-evident in nature in the opening of the teacher's account, actually defines anything specifically Jewish out of existence. Jewishness per se is now redundant. And this has been shocking to commentators because they don't know how to handle this kind of almost erasure of distinctive Jewishness at this point, right? He says that true circumcision is of the heart, right? And so he's redefining Judaism, but what he's saying is the teacher has redefined Judaism in this way at this point. So Paul's not erasing his ancestral tradition, which tends to be how this gets read. He's suggesting that the rival in his aggressive sort of opening erases his ancestral tradition and erases his Judaism at that point. And that's pretty shocking. That would make the teacher feel pretty embarrassed. So those are the reductions in 2. So you get to this point where in 3:1-9, you get a kind of reaffirmation of the rival teacher's principle of divine judgment in relation to works or desert, which is really just sort of characteristic of any interlocutor in a broadly sort of Socratic sense, who's giving an account too confidently. They'll be forced to sort of restate their position. And Paul in 3:1-9a starts questioning directly the teacher. So that's where you have that dialogue back and forth. So Paul's the one asking the questions there. And what ends up happening is that Paul is setting a trap kind of on the teacher. And so that his opponent, the teacher, thunders again his account that God is going to judge even sinful Jews. Remember what just happened? Paul used that as an embarrassment just before, that God will judge sinful Jews. But he's committed to that, so he says it again. And those who have different opinions, the teacher says, their condemnation is deserved, which is what he says. And so he set up this trap, right? And we can kind of see where this is going. So I'm going to quote from 3. Let's see. I'm going to kind of paraphrase through 3. So maybe this will be clear. But if you, the teacher, with this other gospel, insist on maintaining your commitment to divine judgment of transgressors, right, which he already did, then you will find yourself in deep trouble because the scriptures that we all endorse define everyone as being thoroughly sinful. So your gospel can't actually deal with sin, as we have already established throughout 2 with the reductions, right? And your gospel, and so in the light of that, your gospel just ends up sentencing everyone to death by God, including yourself, right? So everyone's now going to get damned, right? And he's basically saying your proclamation has been reduced to dumbfounded silence, right? 3:19-20. There's a silence there. It's essentially useless. The teacher's program is useless. It doesn't work as an evangelistic account of the gospel. It just ends up being an embarrassing silence. And so this is when Paul gets into this really scripturally laced account of depravity, where he's talking about no one is righteous, right? Not even one. So he goes through that and then goes through to 3:19. Okay, that's kind of it in a nutshell. So do you see kind of how that kind of works through 2 and 3?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, now I'm definitely interested in like understanding that. Yeah, that's
a very quick summary of it.
Yeah.
It's as fast as I could do it.
Yeah.
But so that's what's happened. So the teacher gets set up in 118 to 32. He gives his kind of sermon up front, all about desert and obeying God's expectations. And then everyone's held accountable, especially pagans, when they don't do what God has said, because it's revealed to them in nature. So they have no excuse. Whoever you are, you have no excuse. And then Paul comes in chapter 2 and says, hang on a minute, what you just said, let's universalize that and apply it to everyone, including you. What happens? First reduction. What happens is you're going to have righteous pagans running around who aren't saved by the written Torah that you yourself want to maintain as central to Christianity, to this Jewish Christianity. But they don't have to obey it anymore because they have this law that they can see on the cosmos and in their hearts. So pagans can be saved even if they don't follow your program. Reduction 2. This doesn't help Jews either if you emphasize this sort of works desert based account of salvation.
You're breaking up, but you'll probably be back in like a second.
Good?
It's breaking up.
How about now?
You're breaking up pretty bad for a while. Normally it would come back in like a second, but
okay. Am I good now?
I don't know if you can hear me, but can't hear you.
You can't hear me at all.
Yeah, you're back now. No, okay. I can hear you fine now. You're back. Okay. It's like normally it comes back in like a second, but that one took a minute. So if you could repeat like the last 30 seconds.
So the first reduction being righteous pagans can be saved even if they don't take on the teacher's program of works-based salvation, right? They can just figure it out for themselves by looking at the cosmos. Because the teacher already said that up front, right? He said that in 118 to 32. Second reduction. This doesn't really work for Jews either, because Paul gives this example of Torah-observant Jews doing all these horrible things, like hypocrisy, like robbing temples, all of that sort of stuff. So the law doesn't guarantee you salvation either, because of this example of that. And this applies to all Jews who think that the works of the Torah saves them. Okay, doesn't work for Jews either. Third sort of resulting reduction is that righteous pagans who can end up getting saved will kind of laugh at Jews who don't get saved, right? Because that's a possibility now. If Jews don't follow the law correctly, they're going to be in trouble. So now you've included the teacher includes the possibility in his thinking that righteous pagans will be laughing in the face of these overconfident Jewish people. Okay, that's third reduction. And then you get Paul asking very pointed questions not pointed, very just sort of direct questions to the teacher. The teacher restates his position that God is holding everyone under judgment, right? Paul sets up that trap to get the teacher to say, yeah, I guess everyone's in trouble and there's really no hope for anybody. I guess I did that. And then is silenced at the end of that. So Paul has essentially destroyed this other gospel by the end.
Okay. Yeah. That's definitely. Yeah. Hayden asked a question too. He's like, is there any exegetical reason to think that Paul switches from his own voice in Romans 1:17 to the teacher's voice in 1:18?
Yes. Paul uses a gar, which is basically the Greek word that gets translated as for, in 1:18. And gar can be used. One of my friends is doing I'm not going to give away too much here because my friend's doing a dissertation on this, giving more of a clear account of when this voice comes in, and seeing that in Philo, you have all over the place unmarked speech and character, which is what's happening here, introduced by a gar. And all Philo scholars admit that just with that gar, Philo is shifting into another voice and does it for like a full paragraph, quote unquote paragraph in the modern sense, and then comes back in with his own voice. So the gar, it may seem small because it's a single word, But we do have evidence that other Socratic kind of moves in the ancient world are doing this, and I think that's exactly what Paul's doing. And Paul would be trained in doing this. In the ancient equivalent of high school, basically, and in their textbooks, you learn how to engage rhetorically with people in this Socratic way. He would have known this, and there's tons of literature on this, and I could give a kind of bibliography of that if you want, but I don't know how useful that would be. But just if you want to just trust me on this, that
Yeah.
we know that this is the case, that people like Paul would have been trained in this way to argue in this way. So we do have indication from the Gar that there's an introduction, and then in 2:1 you have Paul saying, "You, the Jew." He's using a singular "you" when he turns back on the teacher. Who is the "you"? It can't be a sort of collective "you" because it's in the singular. Who's he talking about? He's talking about the guy who was just talking that he introduced with the Gar.
Okay, nice. Yeah, this gives me a lot to go back and look at. I'd love to like do some research and look into this and talk to you again for sure. Because this is like a whole different way of reading Romans, which is pretty. So that's awesome. So I really appreciate that. Sure. I know.
What happens with that then is that now that Paul is doing something very different rhetorically, there. And this is a rhetorical point. It's not an exegetical point, strictly speaking, the Socratic move, right? I'm saying the text says what it says.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with the usual reading or the old perspective that it does say what it says. It's just doing something different rhetorically and theologically than people think.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So now,
and I definitely go ahead. No, go ahead.
It frees Paul to be a consistent thinker. Now you don't have this text that you have to commit to with him saying a bunch of different and contradictory stuff about God and God's nature and God's expectations than you get in the later chapters of Romans 5-8, where you have this compassionate, loving God that dies for you while you were yet sinful.
Awesome. Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, I'm gonna go back and watch my own live stream one of these. It's like hard to take it all in and like pay attention to what's going on. But yeah, that's awesome. So I appreciate that.
For sure.
I know. Yeah, even Laura and Hayden are down here. That was one of the clearest explanations of the theory I've ever heard. So you got approval from your wife. So doing something good. But I guess the one question, just because I've been thinking about it a little bit, is like the whole New Testament, like textual criticism and stuff, and like whether or not Paul wrote all the letters like that we attribute to Paul and whatnot. Like, does that play into this view at all? Like, do you kind of look at some of the some of the ones that you don't think were written by Paul? Do you look at those a little differently, and that kind of plays into why you hold this view, maybe, or something? I don't know. I don't know how that plays into this.
Yeah, good question. So I'm a 10-letter guy, which means I include Ephesians, Colossians, and 2nd Thessalonians in what I think is authentically Paul. So the pastorals are kind of out for me in terms of authentically Paul. I don't want to say that they're just faked or something like that. And
before, if I could just throw it like when people say like these letters like aren't written by Paul, like do they necessarily mean like they have no connection to Paul at all? Like they're just faked, or is it could just be not necessarily him? Maybe it's just a compilation of some of his work or something like that.
So some people get kind of aggressive with what they say about the pastorals and really kind of dismiss them as faked. I think everyone would admit that they're Pauline in some sense, that it's a guy who's writing in Paul's name who clearly has read Paul and knows Paul's theology well. You have the heart of Paul's theology in all of those pastoral epistles. It's all there. So I would just say that what's going on in the pastoral epistles is that these are quite a bit later on. I don't know where precisely to date them or anything like that, but they are much later. And I think they're really about protecting Paul's gospel from another theology that's coming around that ends up being what we would now call Marcionism. That there's this Marcionist kind of strand of the church that's around, and Paul's the pastoral epistles are responding to that issue. In First Timothy, you get a reference to what he says as the antithesis, as this problem thing. He says the antithesis. Marcion's nickname was the antithesis. It seems like he's referring to Marcion and to Marcionites at that point when he's identifying this other kind of problem approach to the gospel. And so I think that's why we have the pastorals, is to protect Paul's gospel. It's a more conservative kind of protection and a more conservative kind of theology going on there than I think Paul was doing, but it's really a protection against heresy, I think. So they have a really important role in the church, but I just don't think they're written by Paul. Now, does that affect why I want to reread Romans 1-3? No, I don't think so. But I would say that what does actually affect the rereading is something that Paul scholars tend to not pay much attention to, which is Paul's biography and Paul's chronology, the sequence in which the letters were written. So once we figure out the order of Paul's letters, and once we figure out sort of Paul's missionary journey too, we can also see that it makes a lot of sense why there would be this other teacher running around at Rome. Because Galatians, Philippians, and Romans all mention a constituency of people preaching a different gospel that has to do with works of law, especially in Galatians. It's very clear there. But if we give a different account of the chronology than is usually given, usually really thoughtlessly given, because no one really does much work in it anymore, we can see that Galatians, Philippians, and Romans were written about at the same time. They're dealing with we're dealing with them being written within probably 5 years of one another, 4 or 5 years. And they're identifying, I think, when we reconstruct the biography of Paul, they're identifying the same teachers that are there. So you have Galatians mentioning this false gospel, right? And then Philippians, you have people who are enemies of the cross. Romans, at the end of Romans, you have Paul saying, be on the lookout for these other people because they're on their way. And that's why Romans is written. That's why you have the rereading of Romans 1-3. Yeah.
Okay.
Does that answer
Nice.
your question?
Yeah, that does. It definitely does. Like, it's weird, like, when I just thinking about this whole, like, which letters were written when and, like, how that plays into, like, your actual theology and stuff, I think is, like, something I've just starting to explore, I guess. So, yeah, that definitely helps.
Framing Paul, an epistolary biography. It's a book called Framing Paul.
Okay.
It's another of Doug Campbell's work, obviously, and it's he spent a ton of his life on dealing with chronology and biography, and so he's one of really the only people who have been doing this in the recent past. So,
Okay.
if you want to look at how he gets the chronology, how we get to where the teachers are, kind of within that cluster of letters that Paul is writing, that would be a place to go for that. So, and it shows how important it is to interweave Paul's theology with his actual life and missionary journey, which again, a lot of people don't do.
Yeah, I figured he just sat down and wrote them in the order that they're in the Bible, right?
right.
Sent them all out all at once.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I kind of hit a lot of things I had for sure. I know we're about an hour and a half, so it's about a good time. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything else you want to like just touch on before we close up, but
with the rereading stuff, I would encourage people, especially good Protestants, to try and step away from their church tradition for a moment when they sit down next with Romans 1-3. Try to step away from that the best you can and see if you can kind of see how this reading is working. I'm not asking people to buy into it because that's a huge ask. People don't just get convinced by this by just reading Romans once. it takes a long time to really kind of digest this stuff. But my only ask would be, do your best to see if you can kind of see this working and step away from what you've been told about Romans and about Paul.
Yeah, Michael Heiser talks about that a lot too, just like taking off these lenses and stuff. And like I listened to a podcast like this little, but it was about like John 3 and how it's not related to baptism necessarily at all. And so, and you think about, man, like, yeah, like Jesus like rebukes Nicodemus for like not knowing what he's talking about, but yet we interpret it like Jesus is talking about something that didn't start for like another 200 years. So it like really doesn't make any sense. Like he was rebuking him for not knowing the future, like it doesn't. Yeah. So yeah, and I think this is kind of where this plays into too. You can't like act like Paul's talking about something that didn't come about till the Reformation or something.
That's right.
Yeah. So yeah, this was really awesome. I'd love to talk some more. I definitely like. This was really good. I know I enjoyed it. I hope everybody watching enjoyed it.
I really appreciate you asking me to come on and say a bunch of weird stuff about Paul, which is what I
do. And since Laura messed up the stream, maybe she'll come on too at some point. Yeah. So well, I appreciate it. Yeah, I thank everybody for watching. I guess we'll close out here. Cool. And thank you everybody, and we're gonna end it. And God bless.
Thanks, man.